In this lecture, I will provide the general outline and various neural elements involved in voluntary action. You see here a sports person, a discus throw. Look at him. Look at the way he is standing and how he is trying to bring the action in and how he is focused. Okay, here I have another example. Maybe you must have seen such things in a circus. So observe the action by this gentleman. See how he is trying to move on this rope. And see how he is trying to balance and how he is focused with his purpose. Okay, now I have another thing. This is a marathon running. Most of the cities, they conduct marathon runs. And this is one of them. Look at them, each one of them. You can have each one of them. They have particular things, stance. So this gentleman, you look at him, how he is, where he is seeing and what he is doing, and he's this person, and the other persons, this person. So look at that, and you try to have your impressions with you. When I discuss, you will try to know about the impressions. Yeah, this is one. Maybe this is we know that Milka Singh. That is the running Singh. So you can just see that how he is trying to run. See the change here and the body structure and keeping on toes, and see the balancing and the alternate movements. The alternate movements, that means this leg and this leg, how they are alternating, and even the upper limbs. Oh, look at that. It's one of those brilliant catches. And look at the person fielder here trying to grab the ball, and how he is focused. See the stance, almost he is not touching. He's flying in the air. Have your impression? Yes, this is a javelin throw. Observe the action and make your impressions. Yeah, one more of them trying to take a jump or a dive. Just see that. It's really marvelous. And look at the stance, positioning, and trying to keep the limbs. Yeah. So these are two couple, they are dancing, trying to synchronize each of their footsteps, and enjoy. Yeah, this is one of the ballet dance scene. You just see that she's just there on the tip of the toe there. Perfect. You can try a line there, and balancing and weight bearing. Yeah, this is Bharatanatyam. You just see that. She's trying to have this pose, typical pose, and trying to express out number of things. What are these? So I have shown so many examples. Now I tell walking, talking, laughing, eating. These are certain things. Running, swimming, cycling, motorbiking, so on. Rope walking, jumping, somersaulting. Dancing, discus throw, javelin throwing, many other gymnastic actions. What are they? Yes, they are voluntary actions. They are voluntary actions. Now, what are these voluntary movements? How they are brought about? And what are the various neural pathways involved? So that is what our discussion in the coming lecture series. What are the common points in the actions I had shown? I had shown several of the actions. Just to picturized them, I have just collected the pictures and images and trying to bring in you or bring your attention to these particular actions. What are the common points in these actions? One, action. Action is the one common point. That means producing some movement. Action, I am meaning producing some movements of the body. The movements of the body at will. So that is one. That is the action. Action of. Then number two, if you have seen, each of these are associated with the balancing the posture and equilibrium. Maintaining the posture and equilibrium. That is the number two, posture and equilibrium. So it is action in the beginning, then posture and equilibrium. Then coordinating, trying to balance or trying to coordinate one another, one events after another. And sensing, you see those two dancers, they are trying to coordinate each other, or even within the actions, there is a coordination. That's the coordination. This is another common point. Fourth one is the planning of the action. That is one thing which is not seen, but it is being happening. Then fifth one is there is already a background activity, that is a segmental activity and a pattern activity. And this segmental activity and a pattern activity cannot be stopped. It is over and above this segmental and pattern activity. I mean to say, the voluntary action, is a resultant of the combination of all of these points. Now, here I am trying to put in you the action. Where is the action? Action here in the limb, here in the lower limb, upper limb. So look at that, neck muscles. These are distal muscles. These are distal muscles. The center for these actions is cerebrum in the cortex. Then you also see both of them are in erect posture, trying to maintain the equilibrium. They are not falling down. Both of them, they are having a definite posture. That is maintenance of the posture and equilibrium and gravity. So this is done by these axial muscles. That means the muscles of the back, and these are around the vertebral column. These are axial muscles. These axial muscles, and they are these posture regulating and equilibrium regulating mechanisms. They are in the spinal cord and also above the supraspinal level, starting from the medulla, pons, the midbrain, and even including the cortex, cerebral cortex. Now, these two couple are dancing. See, look at that dancing. This dancing requires a planning, even in as a solo or as a joint. In dual or in a joint dancing like this, there would be a planning of these two individual thoughts. Sorry about that. Planning of the individual sequence of movements for sensing. That's important. So that means planning. This planning, what are the next step, or what are the things? What is the music we are trying to listening to, and how we are going to take a step each other. So that means if you are seeing a good dancers, you will see it will be amazing to see them dance each other. So that requires a planning. The planning is done by the basal ganglia. Then we have because they are not falling down, they are trying to balance themselves, and they are coordinating the muscles, the limb, upper limb, lower limb, and even within the limb, there is a coordination of the muscle activity within the self or between them. There is a coordination that is done by the cerebellum. Then there is a pattern of activity. That means the pattern of activity is according to the music they are playing. They are moving in a particular sequence, sequence of the agonist and antagonist group of muscles, even with the facial groups, even sensing the laughing and expressing the joy. That is another. That is the pattern of activity. That pattern of activity is at the segmental level or little suprasegmental level. So that means they have to move the steps up and down like this. That means when you are trying to move the steps, it is the gait. This gait has the very complex series of patterns between the extensors and flexors, and the forelimb muscles and the hind limb muscles, or the distal or the lower limb muscles and the upper limb muscles, and all those things are to be sequenced. So that is the pattern. Then these persons have a muscle tone. You can just see the tone here. The muscle tone here in this calf muscle, and this muscle tone has to be maintained. If there is no tone, or if there is atonia, she will fall down. So these are the various common points and the centers associated. So I mentioned for the actions, it is the distal muscles for making any motion. For maintaining a posture and equilibrium, it is the segmental and suprasegmental centers. The planning of the action is done by the basal ganglia. The coordination is done by the cerebellum. The pattern of activity is generated within the spinal cord or brainstem areas, and the segmental activity is for the segmental level. Now, going further, thus these actions involve three categories of movements, and these categories of movements are sensed and superimposed. Even if you are looking at here, you can just look at that. He is trying to move the limb. So moving the limb over three categories. One, maintaining the muscle tone here, posture here, muscle tone and posture. That's one. The second, the pattern rhythmic activity. Third, the movement of the limbs as such. Now, here there is what is called a reflexive activity, rhythmic activity, and voluntary activity. These three things are happening in these actions: reflexive activity, rhythmic activity, voluntary activity. Reflexive activity for the maintenance of the posture and tone, rhythmic activity from the whatever the locomotion or a particular rhythm to be activated, and the voluntary actions. For the rhythmic activity, you can just see how a tabla player plays a tabla, and it is amazing to see them playing for the rhythm. See how even the simple hand movement, it is going on like this. Now, the reflexive activity, I take one by them. The reflexive activity, it is involuntary. It is an involuntary coordinated pattern of muscle activity. This is being driven by the muscle length and stretch. Muscle length and stretch, and is involved or is being performed by the sensitization by the gamma motor neurons. Of course, there is a 1A alpha linkage is there. The gamma motor neurons superimpose, so that is what the reflexive activity. that is maintenance of the muscle tone and the posture regulation. So even the reflexive activity generated by the semicircular canals, you try to orient in a different space, different the motions, the linear or gravitational motions or vertical motions. So now these are all triggered by the muscle length or some other inputs. That is always a peripheral stimuli. It is triggered by the peripheral stimuli. In case of the muscle tone, it is the muscle length. And in case of the posture regulation, it is the overall proprioception from the periphery as well as the proprioception from the semicircular canals and otolith organs. This is the reflexive activity. One of the beautiful example of the reflexive activity is the mastication, not the mastication, it is the swallowing. In the swallowing, we have the reflexive activity. That means the presence of a food in the mouth, you start chewing and then mastication, followed by the deglutition process. The reflexive activity of the deglutition begins. That is the first phase or oral phase of the deglutition. That is a reflexive activity. Then comes the rhythmic activity. What is the rhythmic activity? If I were to take it further with the swallowing itself, that means rhythmically contracting certain group of muscles and then trying to move the bolus downward into the esophagus. That is this part, the oropharyngeal part, the oral part and the pharyngeal part, it is a voluntary in these things. So to begin with, it is voluntary, then subsequently it becomes involuntary. Now, rhythmic activity in case of the skeletal muscles, repetitive rhythmic motor patterns of movements, just like this dancing. In the dancing sequence, he has to move the limbs and the upper limb and the lower limb in a pattern, in a definite pattern. So that is the repetitive rhythmic motor activity. Of course, this dancing becomes dancing when this pattern has some grammar. If he is throwing the limbs this side, that side, wayward, so then it cannot be a dance. It's something different. So it's a repetitive, rhythmic, and it's definitive pattern of movement. That comes the second part, the rhythmic activity. Especially the examples are walking, talking. If talking means I'm trying to give a lecture, you just see that when I'm trying to give a lecture, I have to there will be certain rhythmic activity of certain group of muscles from the laryngopharyngeal floors or laryngeal muscles and the pharyngeal muscles, even the neck muscles and the mouth or the mouth muscles. All these things are to be activated, because then only sound. What is sound? Sound is something the vibration of the vocal cords by moving air, and the without air it cannot vibrate. So like that, it's talking, walking, scratching, even scratching, the swallowing, chewing. These are some examples of the rhythmic activity. Then circuits of these are located in the spinal cord and brainstem. These pattern generators, the pattern generators have definitely three levels, or they are located at three levels. One at the spinal cord level, one at the midbrain level, that's the mesenchymal level, and one at the cortical level. The circuits of these basic circuit lies in the spinal cord and brainstem. Then these circuits are governed by the midbrain circuits, wherein these particular actions are monitored or refined. Then cortical circuits, which will try to have a voluntary, or either a voluntary break or make. So that means they will try to initiate, or they may try to stop. So there are three levels of the circuitry. These rhythmic activities may occur spontaneously because it may happen if you have a bolus in the mouth, it may start. But usually they are triggered by stimuli. That's about rhythmic activity. So by voluntary wish or will, we can stop or start them or hasten them or slow them. You have a voluntary control over the rhythmic activity. Suppose if I am talking, I can talk slow, I can increase the voice, I can just give a pause. So all these things are the examples of the voluntary control over my speech. So that is what the rhythmic activity is. So then voluntary activities. So what I said, reflexive activity, rhythmic activity, voluntary activity. Voluntary activity, if you are talking about it, it's a goal-directed movements. You have a definitive purpose for which you are doing an action because the brain is involved here. So the goal-directed movements. And these goal-directed movements, say for example, you are now performing certain practical skills, or you become a surgeon. It's a voluntary because you wanted to be a surgeon, you are becoming a surgeon. And once you start doing a surgery, that operations, you cut and you treat the fascia and you separate them and you find the whatever the organ and you do whatever the resection you want to do. And all those things in the beginning, they may become difficult. You may have a tremors in the hand, but later on it becomes easy. So that means as you practice day by day, they are refined, and this refinement is done by the feedback and feed-forward mechanisms associated with the spinal cord, the vestibular system, and the cerebellum. This feedback and feed-forward mechanisms to the voluntary actions by the cerebellum, from the cerebellum, from the spinal cord to the cerebellum, cerebellum to the reticular system or the retinucleus, so on. These refinements are made. Then by doing refinement, the skill and the precision comes into the voluntary action. It becomes you are more skilled. You just imagine yourself when you started writing the alphabet. You imagine your childhood, if you can remember. The writing of a first letter of the alphabet, whether it is A, or whatever you say. So that first letter of the alphabet, when you have begun, it was so difficult for person who is teaching you, your mother maybe, or your elder brother or sister, who are struggling hard to make you to write. And once you start, this is the goal-directed motion. Once you start doing, so then you will perform or you do it. Then the skill and precision comes. You do it with the precision. You do with the perfection. So that is how the voluntary activity develops. That refinement also comes. In the beginning, when you are writing, you must have broken the tips of the pencils several times. Then finally, now you do it very smoothly. So that is the skill. Or even as a matter of fact, you have started using the mobile phones. And the mobile phones, you need the small little space. In this little space, the entire world is there, that internet. And you try to hit on the icons, and those icons are small little icons, and then you hit precisely on that, you develop the skill. So that is the precision you develop. So for this voluntary activity, you require a motor cortex in consult. I'm using the word consult. In consult with the basal ganglia for planning, programming, cerebellum, again maybe for planning and coordination, brainstem to bring the posture, posture for a particular action, and other higher centers. That means the prefrontal cortex and other um, centers in the limbic system. So that is about voluntary activity. Now come back, sir. The voluntary actions, you just try, I'm just trying to build, these are, I'm trying to summarize these voluntary actions right here. These are goal-directed, willful movements. Another important characteristic of these voluntary actions, they improve upon when they are repeated. You keep doing one after another. The second one is better than the first one. Third one is better than the second one. Like that, you keep on improving and improving. And there is no end. Anytime you are, it's all so. And again, you will be doing that particular task with ease, without spending much energy. You just imagine a toddler, that is the infant, or he's trying to take the first steps. You can just see that how difficult it was for the infant. Think about your own learning of the bicycle riding. So how you learned the bicycling. So in that you have a two-wheeler. In these two wheels you have to balance, you have to hold the handle and then pedal, and so many things. You may be trying to, you may not look in front, focus your front, you are trying to see your legs movement and the pedal movement. So it was so difficult a task to perform. And then after a while you become very proficient in it. Learning to write alphabets, I mentioned alphabets during your childhood days. These are all voluntary actions. They were difficult to start with. Recall your family doctor. So you just imagine yourself, your family doctor, how efficiently he examines you and elicit the signs and take history. That means history is the art of communication. He communicates with you and performs the minor or major surgical procedures without much difficulty, or even whatever the interventions. These are all the voluntary actions. Now, we have 4 questions on these voluntary actions. What triggers them? How the actions, voluntary actions begin? Where they begin? Which parts of the brain initiate it? These are some primary questions for everybody when they come. What are these voluntary actions? What makes them, or what triggers them? Now, these are 4 questions. I answer these 4 questions in the coming discussion. In the beginning of this lecture, I asked you all whether I am audible or not. That was the question. Yes, one of you told or responded to me, yes, sir. We mentioned that, yes, sir. So this is one of the example of the voluntary action. Now, let us dissect this particular action of yours itself, which happened during this lecture itself. What are the various neural elements involved in bringing this action? Because this is a voluntary action. I said that this is a voluntary action. What are voluntary action is? You pronounced yes, sir. So that means your vocal cords are acted upon. Now, what are the various neural elements involved in bringing this action? That is to say yes, sir. Now, start here. The first is perception of the auditory signal. What is the auditory signal? I asked the question, am I audible? That was my request. So now, what you heard the sound, that sound is translated into words, and the words give a meaning, because these things are all happening. The sound is heard in the auditory area number 1, auditory area. Then the sound, the words have to be deciphered, the words have to be understood. Am I audible. 3 words. Am I audible? So now these 3 words are to be analyzed, and then what is the meaning? Meaning of those words are deciphered. So that happens to the auditory association area in association with the memory hippocampus. Then after this thing, yes, you understood what I mentioned. That means a meaning of that question was given. And once you have understood my request, now what happened? That request was sent to the Wernicke's area to the Broca's area. That is the premotor cortex. Now the premotor cortex sends impulses. Now giving a meaning of the sound, making it as a command. Now the sound becomes a command. So this request now has become a command. Now this command from the auditory cortex, association cortex, and then to the hippocampus via the memory lane. Then it will reach to the prefrontal cortex because it has to be decision making, whether you want to respond or not to respond. Since I am asking, since a teacher is asking you, now it becomes imperative for you to say or respond. So then you responded accordingly. That decision making, it is the prefrontal cortex. Now, what was the decision making? So that means the decision making is yes, to say the words yes, sir. Now this yes, sir has to be pronounced by the vocal cords. So the vocal cords are being governed by the premotor cortex and the motor cortex and the Broca's area, that is a motor speech area. And all these things send impulses to the vocal cord muscles, that is contraction of the vocal cords, and brings about the action, vocalize, yes, sir. So I have dissected out your action plan. I have dissected out your simple voluntary action, which we saw today. Now, same thing. I have taken this graph from the Ganong. The purpose here is the idea. Idea is the beginning of any voluntary action. For any voluntary contraction, it is the idea. Idea in the example I had given, it is the command. It is the command I gave. That means, am I audible? That was the command. Or sometimes this idea may be self-driven. Self-driven means, see, look here, you all gathered around 4 o'clock and you logged in. So that itself is a voluntary action. That is self-driven. You came because you wanted to learn and you wanted to attend the lecture. That is the motivation or driving force, either self-driven or driven by external force. External force is what I asked. So then all these things produces a command line. And okay, these are two things for the voluntary action. There is another thing. If there is a threat to your life, particular sitting in a particular position, maybe there is an electrical short circuit happening. Can I sit here like that quietly? There is a threat to my life. So then I have to get out of that place. So the threat to the life make you motion or move out of the place. That is one thing. So that is any sequence of events, even a blast or a wild creatures or any other thing that may make you to move or take away. Or even you are placing your hand on the hot plate and you have to remove. So these are the commands. These are voluntary actions. So threat to life. Or there are physiological needs. Physiological need means the bladder, bowel, bladder emptying or a bowel demands. So that emptying of the bowel or bladder, these are trying to force you to do the voluntary actions. Go find a social place wherein you can go to the restrooms and try to empty your bowel or bladder. Or eating because you are hungry, that is another thing, driving force, that is the physiological need. So you want to go to a restaurant and you want to have a sumptuous meal. So that is eating. or you are hungry and you want to eat, there is a place. So these are the another thing. Then self-identity, trying to prove yourself that present, I am present. Suppose if I ask you a roll call, so then what do you say? If I ask her a particular number, that particular number would answer yes sir, no sir, or whatever. So that's self-identity. So then voluntary actions are voluntary contractions because seldom they are sometimes what happens, there is a boredom. In that boredom, then you will try to involve yourself in a voluntary actions. So now, whatever these six places I have mentioned, they all lead to this idea formation. Now, from this idea, it will reach to the cortical association area, especially the motor association area. From the prefrontal, this idea comes from the prefrontal cortex. This prefrontal cortex receives input from number of other elements, which I will be focusing on later on. That would come to the this motor association area. So now this motor association area, that would talk to the two important centers subcortically. One, the basal ganglia, and another, the lateral cerebellum. Now, first it will talk to basal ganglia and asks for the planning. So now the basal ganglia provides the planning, sequencing, and whatever the programming of the particular action. That would send to this premotor cortex, premotor or motor cortex. So that means that from the motor association area, sends impulses to the basal ganglia, that comes to the premotor and motor cortex. They give the planning and programming. Then this also adds to the planning and programming. They will give to the premotor cortex, the lateral part of the cerebellum. Especially the lateral part of the cerebellum is connected with the cerebrum. So these two things, now the premotor and motor cortex receives the input. The idea has been translated into already been planned and programmed for a particular action. This planning and programming, which group of muscle to be activated, how they are to be activated, what is the posture to be retained, which of those pattern generators are to be suppressed and which of the pattern generators are to be activated, whether the muscle tone has to, how to modulate the muscle tone, all those things are performed here in this. Now, after that, it would send the action plan. This is the action plan that would go to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord to the muscles for movement or for motion. Okay. So now, when they are, okay, this is one thing it's happening. Now, at the same time, when they are in motion, say for example, they have sent a plan to the motion, and this motion, it is trying to perform action, and whether the activity generated in the motor cortex, if it is not adequate or adequate, so this is assessed by the feedback signals to the cerebellum. So now the cerebellum receives the feedback signal. And the cerebellum also receives the signal from the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex tells the cerebellum that this is the intermediate part of the cerebellum or the spinal part of the cerebellum, wherein it says that, okay, I have sent this command and this movement has taken place, and this movement, how much is the movement taken place, that is coming to the intermediate cerebellum. This compares, this is actual, what is being asked to do, and this is actual. This is actual. This is what is asked. So now these two are matched. Suppose if there is a discrepancy, it would correct. It would send impulses so that the muscles are either activated more or stopped. So this is a correction point. So that means the motion is corrected. Say for example, you are trying to lift a empty box. Suddenly you will just, you may fall down. That means during that time, the correction will take place. This is one thing. Now, second part, when there is a motion, This sends back to the information to the cortical proprioceptive inputs reach to the premotor and motor cortex. So that would again further either continue or trying to suppress. Same thing happens here from the intermediate cerebellum. This will reach to the premotor and motor cortex. Thus, this action becomes refined. See how it is being refined here. So this whole thing is operative. If I keep doing again and again, so this will improve. This is the pathway for voluntary action. So now the pathway for voluntary action involves the ideation, the planning and programming, and the execution. These are execution and then correction. 4 components, they are there in the voluntary contraction. Now, here I have listed those 4 or 5 corrections. The ideation, the idea, what are the parts of the brain involved? It is just starting with the association area. Just for example, today's example, am I audible? That was the question. So this is the association area. That is the parieto-occipito-temporal association area was activated. And from the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, it was communicated to the hippocampus. Memory, in the memory, it matched the memory and see what is that, am I audible? What is the meaning of that? And after knowing the meaning, then that meaning was translated and sent to the prefrontal cortex, because this was the request made by HOD. So now that request, now the prefrontal cortex analyzes whether it is feasible, whether it should be executed or not to be executed. The decision making is done by the prefrontal cortex. Now the prefrontal cortex and it will also assess with the sensory cortex, the cingulate cortex, the insular cortex for the importance and other perspective of the ideation. So that means idea is generated in the prefrontal cortex in association with the association areas, the parietal areas, the cingulate areas, and the insular cortex. Now, this ideation now becomes a command that means within itself. That command, it sends to the motor association area, and to the various subcortical areas, from the motor association area to the subcortical area, where it will send it to the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, lateral part of the cerebellum, and which provide planning and programming of the particular action. And this planning and programming are sent to the premotor and motor cortex. The premotor and motor cortex. So now the planning is done in the premotor and supplementary motor area in association with the basal ganglia and cerebellum, and then they will be sent to the premotor cortex, that is for execution, for performing. Now the cortex, these cortex sends impulses down to the spinal motor neurons for the action. At the same time, it will send information to the intermediate or spinal part of the cerebellum. Now, what happens? These motor neurons are executed. When the motor neurons are activated or the muscle is activated, there is a proprioceptive inputs come back to cerebellum. Whether what is being asked, what is intended, and what is done, are they matching or not matching? That is performed in the cerebellum. That is a correction and coordination. That is that receives a feedback signal from the brain stem and the spinal cord. That means the muscle is contracting. When the muscle contracts, the proprioceptive inputs reach back to the spinal cord and through the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts that would reach the cerebellum, and they will try to correct and coordinate the action. The final action is done by the spinal motor neurons, the alpha motor neurons for the muscle contraction, for regulating the tone, it is the gamma motor neurons. So both alpha and gamma motor neurons are involved for the action, and it is finally the muscles both, especially the extrafusal fibers contract, bring about an action. That is the entire various parts of the these idea, plan, and execution, and the neural elements associated with each one of them. Now, come back here. It's a sort of a just a revision of what I have been talking about. The idea or command which has been generated in the prefrontal cortex because of the whatever we call the planning of the movement is performed by the basal ganglia, and arrange appropriate movements, group of muscles at different joints, that is again through the basal ganglia and cerebellum. Now adjust the motion by comparing with the plan and performance. That means the plan is by the cerebral cortex, the performance is by the spinal cord. Both are linked here in the cerebellum. That is a correction and coordination. Then keep doing, or if they are repeated, these basal ganglia cerebellum circuits become refined, they become precise, they become perfect. That is the skill. They improve at each level, at each point, they improve their performance. The synaptic plasticity takes place, and it becomes easy, and the new networks develop, and that is what we call it as a skill. So now I have mentioned about how the skill developments comes in by the voluntary action. How the planned movement is executed. So now just briefly about arrange appropriate group of muscles and joints involved in the action. Adjust the motion by comparing the plan and performance by feedback circuit through to the cerebellum. That means the muscles, joints, tendon, skin send proprioceptive inputs to cerebellum through the spinocerebellar tracts and smoothen the responses. Learning by doing again and again. So that means the planning, that movement, you can learn the movement again. If you keep doing again and again, you would refine and you will become skillful. And your performance will better at each day after day. Now, summarize. Your voluntary action begins with the idea. From the idea, it sends impulses to the motor association area. Motor association area sends impulses to the premotor cortex. At the same time, it consults or it sends impulses to the basal ganglia for providing the plan of the work or how it is to be done, and the lateral cerebellum. The basal ganglia and lateral cerebellum, they provide the planning, and then comes the premotor cortex. Here, the execution part begins, the action part begins. They will send impulses to the motor neurons here for the movement. And from the movement, when start moving, there is a feedback signals reach the cerebellum. They will try to correct the motion. And at the same time, this premotor cortex provides the information to the cerebellum that is the planned movement, and this is the real movement, the actual movement. Planned movement and actual movements are compared here in the cerebellum. That's for the execution. The movement when they are doing, they will reach back or give a feedback signal to the motor cortex. And the cerebellum also gives the motor cortex. And these things are intercommunicated here as they are saying. Even the idea, it has started, even there are signals going back here telling the prefrontal cortex, yes, I obeyed your orders. That is the planning of the voluntary movement. Now, I stop here because the next class I will tell what are the pathways involved in voluntary movement, because I did not talk about the pathways involved. Here I have given the very generalized plan of the voluntary action. generalized plan of the voluntary action, how it is at the different segments. I have made into three different segments. Now, in the next class, I will look into what are the pathways involved in voluntary. Now, these are the reference books, taken it from Genong, especially the previous thing I have mentioned is from Genong. I have referenced the guidance and the Candles textbook of Neuroscience and Samson Wright's Physiology. Okay, so these are some assignments. Describe a general outline of voluntary muscle contraction and with the help of a labeled diagram. I have already given the labeled diagram. Mention the parts of the nervous system involved in each component, because I had provided all that. Then write short notes on. You try to bring in these reflexive movements, rhythmic movements, voluntary movement, ideation of voluntary action, executive components of voluntary action, coordinating and corrective parts of voluntary action, the planning components of voluntary action, command generation of voluntary action. See how I have split the chapter into different segments here in this assignment. Okay, so now the next lecture, I will talk about the origin and course of a corticospinal tract and the lesions of the corticospinal tract. So in this lecture, I will answer that question, what are the various components. Thank you.